This is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the birthing stool, and there is no strength to bring them forth. Hello everyone, this is Gilgamesh, and today we are in Isaiah chapter 37, continuing our series on Isaiah. And where we left it off last time, the Rav Shakeh had come with the armies of Assyria outside the walls of Jerusalem, was making all sorts of threats and taunts to the city of Jerusalem in the hearing of all the people. The people stood firm under the orders of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah's 3 men that had gone out to negotiate with them headed back in to deliver the threats to King Hezekiah himself. And that's where we pick it up today, starting in verse 1 here. As soon as King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. So the 3 negotiators who had been sent out came in with their clothes torn, which was a sign of distress in the ancient world. And so King Hezekiah hears it, and he also tears his clothes and goes then to the temple. Now, this is interesting on a couple of levels. Hezekiah is not a priest, yet he seems to have full access to the temple. And it does not sound like this is simply the outer chambers. It seems that Hezekiah himself is permitted into all areas of the temple. And so one of the things to remember here is that what becomes practice in later centuries around the temple is not necessarily true during the time of Hezekiah. And so Second Temple practices may not reflect very well what First Temple practices were like. It does seem that more people had access to the temple. We see different groups of people on regular basis ascending up to the temple and offering up their worship there. Hezekiah seems to be one of these. His position as king, of course, gives him extra special access, but he here goes to the temple, which tells us a bit about the importance of the temple in his society. The temple was not just a place where priests offered ritual sacrifice, it was seen as a communication spot with God. And this has been true in several places since the temple was first put up by Solomon, that it was a house of prayer, that the prayers were focused towards the temple and from there would go up to God. When Jonah is down in the depths of the sea, he prays to the temple where his prayer is heard. And so the temple was this conduit for communication, and that is one of its primary functions. And so Hezekiah goes into the house of the Lord. Now, afterwards here, it says, and he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priests, covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah son of Amos. Now, Yoach, the recorder, will not be appearing in today's chapter. We don't know why. He just suddenly disappears from the story, and he seems to be replaced with the elders of the priests. So we still have Eliakim and we still have Shebna, but Yoach has decided to not appear in this episode. So we send the 2 of the 3 counselors here and elders of the priests. So these are from the priesthood class, the more senior people of them, I would assume. He has everybody dressed in sackcloth and sends them over to prophet Isaiah to deliver the message there. Now, Jerusalem wasn't a big place. There seems to be a lot of formality with this, that the way they're doing it seems to be very stylized and formal. I don't think there would have been any problem with Hezekiah and Isaiah probably talked a lot, but this is some sort of a formality they felt was necessary to put him over here. And it becomes even more obvious in the next verse, because they don't just go, help Isaiah, we need some help. No, Hezekiah has prepared a line of poetry for them. And I think this tells us a lot about the relationship between Hezekiah and Isaiah. Isaiah writes primarily in poetry. Almost everything he has, except for these chapters, is in poetry. And this was an important part of his mission, that he didn't just speak in normal tones. When he delivered the word of the Lord, he did so in verse, it seems. Now, maybe not every time was in verse. We don't really know. All we have is his preserved writings, but it seems that that was a trademark of his. And so Hezekiah, apparently his faithful student here, decides to compose a verse to give to Isaiah and has his messengers specifically deliver his words to Isaiah, not just as a simple help me, but as poetry. And we have here in verse 3, and they said to him, this is the messengers to Isaiah, thus saith Hezekiah, this is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. Now, this point of birth here, Robert Alter translates that as the birthing stool, and I think he might be right on that. I think that's a fine way to translate it. It is a rare word, and it comes from a root that means to break or to shatter. And it is unclear if it is a reference to a part of the woman's body, such as the cervix, that would be involved as the point of birth, or if it is a place or, would you call it a furniture item, a assistive device that you use during birth, such as a birthing stool. It's not clear what the word actually references, but they have come to this point where they are supposed to be pushing. You know, if any of you fathers out there know this spot, and any of you mothers out there know it even better, that, you know, this is the point where your wife gets extremely tired and maybe not at her most rational point, and everything that she's worked to up to this point has led to this point, and it is the hardest point because she is exhausted. And she, at this point, must continue to push forward through the worst part. And so this is the metaphor that Hezekiah, himself a father, says to Isaiah, himself a father, who likes to talk about the process of having children here as one of the metaphors he uses a lot, that this is where we're at here. We have gone through the tough labor. We've been through all the months of bearing the children, all the hours and hours of the labor pains, and now we are at the final point, and I don't know that we have the strength to do it. That's what Hezekiah is saying here. And Hezekiah, you must remember, for years has been preparing for this moment. He had people take down their houses if their houses were made of stone so they could reinforce the walls. He drilled a tunnel through solid rock, almost a kilometer long, to bring in water supplies into the city. Everyone has known this is coming. Everyone was preparing for this moment. This is not a surprise. It is not something that they suddenly woke up and it was there. This is something they have lived with. This is something they prepared for carefully. And now it is here, and we don't know if we have enough strength. And so this word here might mean the part of the woman's body like the cervix. It might mean the equipment used, such as a birthing stool. Interestingly enough, a word spelled exactly the same way that comes from the same root actually means the surf, where waves break. So that's an interesting thing there. But here they have come to this point here, the birthing stool, and we don't know if we can do it. We should also mention here that we learn a little bit about the role of prophets, that Isaiah was not just seen as somebody who delivers a message from God, but is also seen as a holy man who has the power to intercede with God. And that this puts him in a role similar to Elijah or Elisha, that people believe that he's not just there to deliver some message, but that he also has power and influence with God himself. And this comes to us in the next verse here. Perhaps the Lord your God will hear the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to mock the living God. And he will rebuke the words that the Lord your God has heard. Therefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that are found. Okay, I have to admit, I read through that verse several times trying to get a good sense of what I think it's saying. It is a hard verse, particularly that third line in there. And he will rebuke the words that the Lord your God has heard. My sense of what it's saying here is that it's saying maybe the Lord heard what the Rabshakeh said, and he's going to rebuke the words that he heard if you pray and ask him to. But translations vary quite a bit on this line. Some have that he will rebuke him for the words, but that's not correct. There is no him there. It's not that he will rebuke him for the words. He's going to rebuke the words. The words clearly seem to be the thing that is receiving the action in this sentence. Although it's not quite a direct object, because there is a preposition there in front of him. Really, he will rebuke in the words, or with the words, or maybe against the words. Prepositions are flaky things. They don't translate well between languages. But there's a preposition there before the word words, and there's no him or his words. He's going to rebuke the words, and the words themselves seem to hold power. It also isn't completely clear who the subject of the verb rebuke is, or exactly which words are the words that are going to be rebuked. If the subject is the Rabshakeh, then it might be that he's saying that the Rabshakeh might negate the words of prayer that the Lord has heard from the people. So perhaps the Lord has heard the words of the Rabshakeh, and he, the Rabshakeh, will rebuke the words the Lord has heard, the prayers of the people in Jerusalem, from having their effect. Therefore, Isaiah, you lift up your voice and pray to him. That's one way to read it. The other way is that the subject of the verb would be the Lord himself, that maybe the Lord has heard the words of the Rabshakeh, and the Lord might be persuaded to rebuke the words that he has heard. Therefore, Isaiah, you ask him to do that. That could be a way to understand it here as well. So it can really be read either way, and that's part of why translations are kind of all over the place as to what it's saying. But the interesting thing here about this theologically is that power is ascribed to the words of the Rabshakeh. Either power to nullify the prayers of the righteous who have prayed, or that the words themselves require nullification, either by a righteous person or by God himself, that something has to happen to the words. Either that the Rabshakeh's words are going to do something negative to the prayers of the Jerusalemites, or that something needs to be done to the words of the Rabshakeh. The words seem to hold power. And so they're looking at the Lord here to rebuke the words. So this becomes sort of this play of whose words are more powerful. Is it the prayer of Isaiah? Is it the words of the Rabshakeh? And so we have this conflict between the two as to which is most powerful. So verse 5 here. When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Say to your master, thus saith the Lord, fear not before the words that you have heard, with which the boys of the king of Assyria have reviled me." So, fear not before the words. Again, there's this emphasis on the words, rather than the giant army that's sitting outside the walls. Don't be afraid of the words. Army's not even mentioned in this. The thing that they're worried about is don't be afraid of the power of his words. And the army's not even a consideration here. I personally might be noticing the army, but the Lord is saying here, don't be afraid of the words. And then Isaiah calls the servants of Assyria boys, Na'arim. And it seems to be probably a bit of an insult. These lads, these boys that have come to threaten you with these words. So we continue here the delivery of Isaiah's message from the Lord. And we have here in verse 7, "Here am I. placing on him a breeze, and he shall hear a hearing, and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. So we started off here with the behold me, or here am I. And then we have this participle here of placing on him a spirit, a breeze, a wind, a breath. All those are actually the same word in Hebrew. Some translations go with, I'm going to put on him a spirit. But I think breeze or wind is what we're really talking about here. That he's going to like hear a rumor on the wind is the imagery that we're going for. Something insubstantial is the idea here. So I don't think that this is that the Lord's going to put some powerful spirit on him or anything like that. No, I think this is actually just the opposite. This is going to be a breeze, a rumor on the wind, a nothing. He's going to hear a hearing. A lot of translations go with hear a rumor, and that is what we're talking about here. But I wanted to do the hear a hearing because it's a cognate accusative in Hebrew, and they do love doing those. And so we're very carefully constructing this here. That he's going to hear a hearing, and then he's going to turn or return to his own land. We're going to see that verb come up again. We're going to see the verb for hearing coming up a few times here. And we're going to see this verb for turning coming up. And he's going to have him fall by the sword in his own land. So when he goes back home, he's going to die. And so we come here to verse 8. The Rabshakeh did turn. Same verb. The Rabshakeh did turn and found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah. For he did hear, same verb, for he pulled out of Lachish. Now, we don't know exactly where Libnah is. It's a town. It might be to the north or to the west. Nobody really knows. But the big thing of significance here is that the king of Assyria has pulled out of Lachish. Lachish was his major victory, the thing that he'll celebrate on his palace with this big bas relief. It's very odd that he pulls out and just gives it up before he finishes subjugating the rest of Judah. Why? Why would he pull out of his major victory here, a crucial town that he should have held if he wanted to keep the territory? What led to this? Nobody knows. And the text doesn't really tell us. But for some reason, he has pulled out of Lachish, and now he's fighting at this other town of Libnah. And so here's the rumor that the Rabshakeh has apparently left the army there that is still sieging Jerusalem and gone out to see what's happening here and finds this to be the case. And then we have the rumor that he hears. Verse 9. And he heard concerning Tirhakah, king of Cush, saying, he goes out to battle against you. So this is the rumor, that Tirhakah was coming and that the Egypt was on its way. And so this is the rumor that causes them to suddenly turn and have a second priority. Now, there are only 5 pharaohs that are mentioned by name in the Hebrew Bible. Tirhakah is identified with Tirhakah. Boy, those names are hard to say next to each other. Tirhakah is identified with Tirhakah, who reigned from about 590 to 664 BCE. He is king of the 25th dynasty of Egypt. The 25th dynasty is also known as the Cushite or Nubian dynasty, sometimes called the reign of the Black Pharaohs, because it was established by the Nubian king Piye, who marched north from Nubia and conquered all of Egypt, and then went back to Nubia and ruled it from there. We are here at 701 BCE, and about 10 years before Tirhakah would become pharaoh. His father is the one that established this new 25th dynasty by conquering Egypt when he was still a small boy. According to our best guess at chronologies at this point, we believe that Tirhakah is really about 20 years old at this point. He is not yet King Tirhakah, although they call him that in the story. We believe that the title king was probably applied to him retroactively by a later editor who is just looking at him as being King Tirhakah. But at this point, he is probably just an Egyptian warrior leading the armies, an important one to be sure, a prince, but not the king. At this point, Shabaka, which is probably a brother or a cousin, is the actual pharaoh. His father is no more. So he is out there to prove himself as the future king of Egypt and has a high position, and he's moving up through the ranks. So there seems to be a turn of events here. They've lost Lachish, and they're now having to engage with the Egyptians, and they have surrounded the city of Jerusalem, and that seems to be where the whole army is. There seems to be problems at this point, that there is stuff going wrong on their part. And so as much as the story is told of the perspective of this great miracle at Jerusalem, it does seem like several things are coming together behind the scenes to make all of this really devastating for them. So the Rav Shakeh wants to make sure that Egypt doesn't come up and they wind up losing their siege on Jerusalem. So he apparently is going to send yet another communication, this time a written warning to Hezekiah. And what follows here might be a doublet, which is where the same story is told two times. Sometimes several versions of the story circulate, and scholars love to say that they're then edited together. This might be one of those times because there are a lot of elements of the second round of communication that really seem to mirror the first. So perhaps they were two tellings of the exact same story, or perhaps they are two separate communications. Sieges last a while, multiple communications would not be unusual. And yeah, threats tend to sound repetitive no matter what you do. So it's impossible to say. But sometimes this is looked at as a doublet. But we're going to look at it here. It says, and he heard, same verb there again, and he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, do not let him deceive you, your God in whom you trust, saying Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. So, and he heard. I don't know if that's the right verb there. We've mentioned that it does match that he's going to hear a hearing. It is that verb as it's written, but it doesn't look like it's the right verb here. The king's account, remember that this is paralleled in 2 Kings. The king's account here has, and he turned, which is the other verb that we have that could be mirrored here. And so maybe the editor or the copyist here got somewhat confused on whichever text, but turn seems to make more sense here, that, and he would turn to his own land and so forth. So I think this is probably, and he turned. That's how it is written in King, meaning that he would have returned back to the Jerusalem siege. So that would make sense here, that he turned and he sent messengers to Hezekiah. So he's sending in his emissaries with a written text to Hezekiah. And do not let your God deceive you. It's just a very different way of thinking. They assumed each other's gods were real. But they also assumed that they had limited power and that they were not necessarily good, that they would deceive the people who were just pawns in this game of gods. And today we might think it more reasonable to say something like, do not let your prophet deceive you, or even do not deceive yourself. We do not credit to a god as the actual source of a deception, but they did. And so he's saying here, don't let your God deceive you, that your God himself is wrong. He thinks he might be able to save you, or he's leading you on that he might save you, but he's not going to. And we have here in verse 11, there art thou. This is kind of the opposite of here am I. There art thou. You heard what the kings of Assyria did to all lands, to utterly destroy them. And you will be delivered? Have they delivered them, the gods of the nations, which my fathers laid waste? Gozan, and Haran, and Rezeph, and the children of Eden who were in Telassar. Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of the Sepharvaim, Hannah and Eva? Yes, where indeed are these places? We actually don't know where most of them are. He has this list of places. Now, in fairness, we know where a few of them are, but it goes through several places, and the current consensus is that most of these places seem to be places in Mesopotamia and not necessarily close by. But he's listing off all those who have stood against him and have fallen. And for the most part, we don't really know exactly where these cities were. But he's saying here that nobody has been able to stand against the Assyrians. Don't let your God bring you into this same trap where you think you're going to stand against us, and at the end, he does not defend you, and you wind up destroyed. Going here to verse 14. Hezekiah took the scrolls from the hands of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord. So, a couple of things here. One, note that Hezekiah can read. That's not always a given, even for kings. But Hezekiah here reads the scrolls. And then he goes back to the temple. So this is his second trip into the temple here. And he takes with him the scrolls. Again, these words seem to have power. And a physical copy of the words seems to especially have power. And he brings it before the Lord. This generally means one of the inner parts of the temple. He brings it before the Lord, and he unrolls the scroll, presumably so the Lord can read it. So he spreads it out there for the Lord to read it as well. And he begins his prayer to the Lord. What does he pray? Verse 16. Lord of hosts, God of Israel, the one who dwells between the cherubim. You are he, the God by yourself. For all the kingdoms of the earth, you made the heavens and the earth. Okay, a lot of interesting stuff here. He refers to him as the one who dwells, or perhaps the one who sits between the cherubim. Now, first of all, there is no preposition here. It actually is just the one who sits the cherubim. We don't know if he sits on them. We don't know if he sits between them. But the one who sits the cherubim. Now, I will note that in modern Hebrew, cherubim means cabbages. This is probably not referring to cabbages. This is referring to cherubim, which were a type of divine being that does not look like a naked male child. That's not actually the little winged cherub baby thing is not what they had in mind. These are fierce creatures, probably viewed as some type of a winged lion, like a sphinx or something of that nature, probably like the winged bulls that we see in Assyria. These were creatures that were fierce and to be terrifying. And there were two of them on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and there were two large statues of them there in the temple. And so he's referencing those, which means he might be himself in that area of the temple. It would seem to be a natural indication for him to be referencing them there. So he might be before the Ark of the Covenant here as he is praying. And he says, you are he. A lot of translations kind of polish that out. They kind of miss that that's there. It's this really powerful statement. You are he. And I wanted to preserve that in my translation. I think it's a very nice reference there. And you are the Elohim. You alone. You are the God by himself. The Elohim by himself. So there's a very strong statement of monotheism that separates Hezekiah's theology from the Rav Shakeh and his world outlook. For all the kingdoms of the earth is also this very powerful statement. The preposition there, the lamed, often means belonging to. And so it's saying that you are he, the only God, the God alone, belonging to all the kingdoms of the earth. You are the God for all the kingdoms of the earth. This is a very universalist statement. And that is very common through Isaiah, that he talks about this universalist view of God, that he is not just Israel's God, although they refer to him that way, and they're the ones who acknowledge him, that he is actually the God of the whole world, that his power is not merely that of a tribal deity or locked to some regional land, that he is actually the God of all the kingdoms of the earth. And that is what Hezekiah is saying here, that yes, they have been able to romp through the countryside. No one could stand against them, but this is the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God of all the kingdoms. Then we have verse 17. Stretch out, O Lord, your ear and hear. Open, Lord, your eyes and see. And hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he sent to mock the living God. So this invocation to hear and to see is directly what Isaiah and other prophets frequently point out that other gods are incapable of doing. They cannot hear, they cannot see. And he wants them to see all these written words that he has laid out before God, before the ark here, that we're talking about the power of these words. Look at these words. They are put here to mock the living God. And so we come to verse 18. Truly, Lord, the kings of Assyria have put to the sword all the lands and their lands. We'll talk about that in a moment. And have given their gods into the fire, for they are not gods, but the work of the hands of man, wood and stone, and they destroyed them. And now, Lord, our God, save us from his hand, and all the kingdoms of the earth shall know that thou art the Lord, the God by yourself. Okay, so let's go back to that first awkward line there at the top. Verse 18 seems to have a small error here. The book of Kings, which also has this here, has what is probably a better reading, which has all the nations and their lands, rather than repeating the word lands here of all the lands and their lands, which sounds strange and almost certainly wrong. So Kings has all the nations and their lands. So as we talked about, which is older? Did Isaiah copy from the book of Kings? Did Kings copy from the book of Isaiah? Well, did the King's account correct the error that was in the text of Isaiah, making that Isaiah would be the older text? Or did whoever wrote this text in Isaiah introduce an error during the copying process? Scholars love to argue these points as though there was any way to settle that. But then there's this other problem. The Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't match either of them. It just has the nations with no mention of the word the lands. So we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls here that they have put to the sword all the nations in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then to make it more interesting, we have Codex Vaticanus, which is one of the copies of the Septuagint, that agrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what does that do to the argument? Was the oldest text all the nations? And then one of the accounts accidentally replaced the nations with all their lands? And then someone trying to fix that and make the two texts in Isaiah and Kings agree made a compound and said, okay, all the nations and their lands. And then, not to be outdone, somebody else came along and said, well, now they still don't agree because one has a compound, and so they're going to fix it, but they're not very good at fixing things, and so they came up with in Isaiah all the lands and their lands. Maybe. Who knows? You can see how these type of arguments go into circles very quickly, and I have limited trust in some of the dating techniques when we try and say this text is older or younger based on these kinds of differences, because there are so many explanations of how a document can change. Without some type of another copy of the document that has the version that we think might be older, it's really hard to conjecture exactly what happened then. So we're late in the game here with multiple different disagreeing parts of this, and it's almost pointless to try and piece together how it would have played out, because there's just simply nothing but guesswork. Now, that said, this is a beautiful prayer by Hezekiah, and note its envelope structure. We've got here a return of the phrase kingdoms of the earth that he started out with. And he is also intensified with going from thou art he to thou art the Lord. So he has taken the one and intensified it. And then again, the text of Isaiah is damaged here because the word Elohim, the word God, dropped out of it, which should be right after the word Lord, the God by himself. The word Elohim is not there. But it clearly is needed because it should match up with the opening of the prayer, and the version in the Book of Kings has it. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have it, and the Septuagint and the Syriac version. So multiple witnesses have it. It seems quite certain that it was left out by error in our Masoretic text version of Isaiah. It's there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A copyist mistake. So I put it back in the translations. That's a very solid insertion there because it makes the poetry very visible there, how this matches the opening of his prayer here, that thou art the Lord, the God by himself. And so that brings us to a cliffhanger here. Will the prayer work? Will God hear them? Is God capable of saving Jerusalem? Tune in next time. And if you want to find out, like and subscribe and put on the notifications, because it's going to be a fun thing when we talk about what actually happens as Jerusalem faces its fate. Until then, shalom.